The church bells rang with a hollow echo as the townsfolk gathered, their eyes drawn not to the altar, but to the young woman standing there, pale beneath her bridal veil. She was the rancher's daughter, forced into a marriage not of love, but of wealth and land. Her groom was a man whose fortune stretched across valleys, a man chosen to secure power rather than happiness. The rancher stood tall, pride gleaming in his eyes, convinced that his daughter's silence meant obedience. Yet behind her stillness, her heart thundered with dread, for the vow she was about to speak would chain her to a life she did not choose. Whispers ran through the pews, not of joy, but of pity. They knew the girl had no say, for in the Wild West, daughters were often treated as bargaining chips, their futures traded for cattle, gold, or alliances. But the girl's eyes, hidden beneath her veil, carried a fire that no father's command could extinguish. She prayed for deliverance, not knowing that destiny was already riding toward her on the desert wind. The groom, polished and proud, waited with a smirk that revealed more greed than affection. To him, this union was not sacred but strategic, a chance to expand his empire and tighten his grip on the land. He saw the bride as property, a prize to be displayed beside his riches. Yet even as he adjusted his fine coat and brushed the dust from his boots, unease flickered in his gaze. For deep within, he carried a secret that no wealth could bury, a truth he had fought to keep hidden. When the minister raised his hand to begin, the air in the church grew thick, heavy with expectation. The bride's lips trembled, her breath shallow, as if every fiber of her being begged her to flee. And then, before the vows could be spoken, the groom turned, his face pale, his voice trembling as he muttered words that froze the entire congregation. He did not leave her standing at the altar out of fear or shame. He left because the truth he carried would shatter everything: her family's honor, her father's pride, and the fragile illusion of prosperity that cloaked the town. Gasps filled the room as he abandoned the altar, his footsteps echoing louder than the bells had ever rung. The rancher's daughter stood in stunned silence, her heart torn between relief and dread. For the man she was forced to wed had not simply walked away. He had revealed, with a single act, that the foundation of her father's ambitions was about to collapse. And in that moment, the West itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the storm that his truth would unleash. The silence that followed the groom's retreat was heavier than the desert night. The congregation shifted uneasily, whispers rising like rattlesnakes in dry grass. The rancher's daughter stood frozen, her veil trembling with the force of her own breath. Her father's face, once proud and unyielding, twisted with fury as his carefully laid plans began to unravel before the eyes of the town. He had forced this union for wealth, for land, for power, and in one shocking moment, it had all slipped from his grasp. The bride's heart, though still bound by fear, beat with a spark of defiance. For the first time, the man she was forced to marry had made a choice that freed her from a prison built by her father's ambition. Yet freedom came with a price, and the air was thick with unspoken questions. Why had the groom abandoned her in front of everyone? What secret had driven him to throw away riches, land, and pride in one single breath? The truth, she sensed, was larger than betrayal. It was a storm that threatened to consume everything she thought she knew. The rancher bellowed for the groom to be brought back, his voice echoing through the wooden beams of the church. But no man moved to obey him. The authority he wielded with iron fists had cracked in public view, and fear no longer commanded the same obedience. The townsfolk, long accustomed to bowing their heads, now looked at him with suspicion, their curiosity stronger than their loyalty. For in the West, power could shift as swiftly as sand carried by the wind. The bride lowered her veil and stepped down from the altar, her steps slow but steady. Every eye followed her as she walked past her father's glare, past the murmuring crowd, and out into the blazing sunlight. She did not chase the runaway groom, nor did she collapse in shame. She carried herself with a quiet strength, knowing that the truth would find her soon enough. In her heart, a seed of resolve began to grow. She would no longer be a pawn in her father's games. Outside the church, the air was hot, the dust rising with each step she took. Somewhere in the distance, the man who had abandoned her carried a secret that would change everything. And as she looked toward the horizon, she felt the certainty of a story only beginning, one that would pit love against ambition, truth against power, and reveal what kind of woman she was destined to become. The groom's disappearance sent shockwaves through the town. Some claimed he had fled out of cowardice, unwilling to be tied to a family whose greed was whispered about behind closed doors. Others insisted he carried a secret too dangerous to reveal in public, a truth that would shatter reputations and draw blood in the streets. Whatever the reason, his absence gnawed at the people, fueling a fire of rumors that spread faster than prairie flames. The rancher, desperate to save face, forbade anyone from speaking of the incident. He promised that the marriage would be restored, that his daughter would have her place as the wife of wealth and power. But the people's hearts had shifted. They had seen weakness in the rancher's iron stance, and weakness in the West was blood in the water. The more he tried to silence them, the louder the questions grew. And at the center of it all was his daughter, no longer just a bride, but a symbol of a scandal unraveling before their eyes. The bride, torn between anger and relief, could not rest. She wandered the ranch house like a ghost, haunted by the memory of her groom's pale face and trembling voice. His words, unspoken yet heavy, clung to her, a promise of revelation yet to come. She wondered if he had been protecting her, or himself. Was she the victim of betrayal, or the heir to a truth that had been buried beneath her father's pride? One night, unable to bear the silence, she slipped from the ranch house and rode into the hills. The moon guided her path as she searched for the man who had left her. She found no trace of him, only whispers in the saloon of his trail. A man seen riding hard into the desert, his face pale, his eyes hollow, as if fleeing not just from marriage, but from ghosts that clung to him. And there, under the silver glow of the night, the bride made her choice. She would no longer wait for truth to come to her. If the groom carried a secret that threatened to destroy her family, then she would uncover it herself. From the Wild West, truth was as dangerous as a loaded revolver, and she was ready, at last, to hold it in her hands. The desert stretched before her like an endless sea of silence, but the bride pressed on, her determination burning hotter than the sun overhead. Each mile carried her farther from the gilded cage of her father's ranch and deeper into a wilderness where law and pride meant little. Her thoughts circled endlessly, the groom's face pale and trembling, the way his voice cracked as he fled the altar. Whatever truth he carried had shaken him to his core, and she knew it would shake her world as well. At dawn, she reached a watering hole where riders often rested. There she found fresh tracks, hoof prints cutting deep into the dirt, evidence of a horse ridden hard and fast. A ranch hand at the post told her he had seen the runaway groom pass in the night, his clothes disheveled, his eyes wild as if haunted by more than exhaustion. The man muttered that he looked less like a groom fleeing marriage and more like a man fleeing judgment. The bride's heart pounded, for this only deepened the mystery. She followed the trail into a canyon, the walls rising like silent sentinels around her. Every echo of her horse's hooves seemed to carry a warning, yet she pushed forward. She had been silent too long, her life dictated by her father's ambition and her groom's cowardice. Now, for the first time, she chose her own path. The canyon whispered of secrets, and she felt herself riding straight into the heart of them. As the sun reached its peak, she found remnants of a camp, a fire burned to ash, a torn piece of fabric, and footprints leading deeper into the gorge. She dismounted, her breath sharp in her chest, and followed them on foot. Each step felt like a descent into a truth she cannot turn away from, a truth that might ruin her father, or herself. Yet the fire in her eyes did not waver. Whatever lay ahead, she was ready to face it. And then, in the shadow of the canyon walls, she heard his voice, low, strained, carrying the weight of confession. The runaway groom was not alone. He spoke to another man, a figure cloaked in the dust, their words muffled by distance. The bride froze, her heart pounding. The secret was close now, so close she could taste the danger in the air. She crept closer, knowing that once she heard the truth, her life would never again belong to silence. From her hiding place, the bride strained to hear, each syllable falling like stones in her chest. The groom's voice trembled as he admitted the marriage had never been about love or wealth alone. It had been a mask, a way to bury a past too dark to speak of in daylight. He confessed that the rancher, her father, was not only forcing the marriage for power, but to keep hidden a betrayal that reached back years. The bride's breath caught. The words tore at her, unraveling the very image she had of the man who raised her. The other figure, tall and stern, demanded details, his tone sharp as steel. The groom faltered, then revealed the truth. The rancher had wronged men who once trusted him, seizing land through deceit, silencing rivals with threats, and destroying lives to build his empire. The marriage was meant to secure loyalty, to keep dangerous secrets buried under the guise of unity. But the groom had discovered something more damning, proof written in contracts and ledgers that could strip the rancher of everything. The bride's world spun. She had grown up believing her father's pride was built on strength, that his wealth was the fruit of hard work and vision. Now she realized it was built on bones, on lies, on the suffering of others. The groom had fled not to abandon her, but to escape being bound to corruption. He had been weak, yes, but not heartless. His cowardice had spared her the chains of a marriage built on deceit. Tears stung her eyes, but not of sorrow, of fury. For all the years she had been treated as a bargaining chip, her father had never trusted her with the truth. He had sought to control her future, to silence her will, while hiding a past that stained his name darker than any outlaw's. Her heart hardened, her resolve deepening. She could no longer stand as the silent daughter of a powerful man. She would become the voice he feared most. And as she stepped from the shadows, her presence freezing the two men where they stood, her voice cut through the canyon air with fire. "Tell me everything." In that moment, the runaway groom's secret no longer belonged to whispers. It belonged to her, and she would decide how to wield it. The West had always belonged to those who seized their fate, and for the first time, she was ready to claim hers. The groom's face turned as pale as the desert moon when he saw her emerge from the shadows. His lips trembled, words failing him as if the truth he had just confessed was never meant for her ears. The man beside him, broad-shouldered, dust-stained, and unflinching, narrowed his eyes at the bride, studying her not as a helpless daughter, but as someone who now held the weight of a revelation too dangerous to ignore. Silence stretched between them like a drawn pistol. The bride's gaze locked on the groom, her voice steady though her heart thundered. "You left me at the altar, not because you feared me, but because you feared my father's lies. Speak it plainly, here and now." Her demand cracked through the canyon air, and there was no mistaking the fire in her tone. The groom faltered, shame flooding his eyes, but under her piercing stare, he could not remain silent. His words tumbled out, of forged deeds, stolen land, and men who had vanished when they dared to oppose the rancher. The stranger confirmed each claim with a grim nod. He revealed himself as one of those wronged, a man whose family had lost everything to the rancher's greed. His voice carried the weight of truth sharpened by years of bitterness, and the bride felt her chest tighten with every syllable. She wanted to deny it, to believe her father's empire was built on honor. But the evidence was undeniable, and her childhood memories now seemed to crack under the strain of revelation. The groom, his voice breaking, admitted he had agreed to the marriage because he was trapped. Her father had discovered his knowledge of the truth and used it as a leash, forcing him into silence through the promise of wealth and fear of ruin. But standing at the altar, staring into her eyes, he had found himself unable to go through with the lie. He had fled not to abandon her, but to save what little soul he still possessed. The bride's fists clenched at her sides, her spirit torn between grief and fury. The West was a land where men fought over cattle, water, and pride, but here she stood, caught in a war of truth and betrayal. The world she had known had shattered, but in its ruins lay something stronger, the chance to rise not as her father's pawn, but as her own weapon. That night, the bride sat by the fire with the two men, her veil long discarded, her eyes sharp as steel. She pressed them for details, demanding names, dates, and proof. The stranger revealed documents hidden in the desert, ledgers that traced every act of theft and deceit her father had orchestrated. The groom, with trembling hands, admitted he had seen them, but lacked the courage to bring them forward. Now, with her standing before them, his cowardice seemed to wither under her resolve. The bride listened in silence, the flames reflecting in her eyes. Every truth struck her like a lash, but instead of breaking, it hardened her. She thought of her father's commands, his prideful words, his cold insistence that wealth was everything. And she realized the chains he had tried to bind her with were already broken. The marriage he had forced upon her had crumbled, and with it, the foundation of his control. Now she stood at a crossroads, to bury the truth and live in its shadow, or to reveal it and burn everything he had built. The stranger warned her of the danger. Exposing her father would not be easy. He had allies, men loyal not to honor, but to gold. The West respected power, and power was the one thing her father still commanded. But the bride's voice was calm as she answered, "Power fades. Truth endures." Her words, sharp as any revolver shot, hung in the desert air. And for the first time, both men looked at her not as a bride or a daughter, but as a force rising from the ashes of deceit. The groom reached for her hand, his voice soft, pleading, "If you do this, you will have no protection. He will turn on you without hesitation." The bride pulled her hand away, her eyes unyielding. "Then let him. I would rather face his wrath with truth than live under his roof with lies." Her defiance silenced him, and in that silence, the fire cracked, sealing her vow as surely as the groom had once sealed his with cowardice. When dawn broke, the bride rose from the firelight with new strength. She was no longer the trembling girl, forced into a gown for her father's ambition. She was a woman armed with truth, and she would carry it back into the heart of the town, no matter the cost. The West had no mercy for the weak, and she would never again be weak. The ride back to town was long, and with each mile the bride's resolve hardened like iron under the blacksmith hammer. The canyon still echoed in her mind, the groom's trembling voice, the stranger's bitter truths, and the proof that her father's empire stood on stolen foundations. The morning sun cast the valley in gold, but to her it revealed only shadows. For the first time in her life, she no longer saw the ranch house as home. She saw it as the lair of a man who had betrayed not just neighbors, but his own blood. When she arrived, the ranch was already buzzing with tension. Word of the runaway groom had spread, and whispers filled every corner of the town. Workers avoided her gaze, uncertain whether to pity or fear her. The rancher, standing tall on the porch, greeted her with a glare sharp enough to cut glass. "You will not shame me again," he hissed. His voice carried the desperation of a man whose grip on power was slipping, and it only fueled her defiance. The bride stood at the foot of the porch steps, her back straight, her eyes unflinching. "The shame is not mine," she answered, her words calm but weighted. "It belongs to you." The workers nearby froze, shocked by her audacity. Never had anyone spoken to the rancher that way, least of all his daughter. Yet the steel in her voice made it clear. She was no longer bound by obedience. The rancher's fists clenched, his voice rising with fury. He threatened to lock her away, to silence her as he had silenced so many others. But for every word of threat, she met him with a truth, each one sharper than the last. She spoke of the stolen lands, the forged deeds, the families left broken in his rise to power. And though she held no papers in her hand, the conviction in her voice struck harder than evidence. She was his blood, and her words carried a weight he could not dismiss. By sunset, the ranch stood divided. Some still clung to the rancher's authority, but others looked at the daughter with newfound respect, whispering that perhaps the truth had at last found its voice. The West was a land that respected strength, and that day, the people saw more strength in her defiance than in the rancher's threats. The days that followed were a storm. The rancher fought to silence the rumors, but every word his daughter spoke spread faster than he could contain. Workers began to question his commands, neighbors hesitated to honor his deals, and the town, once bound by his wealth, began to shift beneath his feet. The bride, once dismissed as a pawn in a marriage of convenience, now walked through the streets with her head high, her presence a challenge to her father's crumbling power. The runaway groom returned quietly, drawn by guilt and fear. He begged her forgiveness, but she did not give it freely. His cowardice had left her alone in the fire, and though his confession had sparked her awakening, his weakness had nearly cost her everything. Still, she listened as he offered the documents he had once hidden, the ledgers, the contracts, the proof that could strip her father of his empire. His hands shook as he placed them in hers, as if surrendering the very burden that had broken him. The bride took the papers without hesitation. In her hands lay the power to end her father's reign, not with whispers, but with undeniable truth. Yet she also knew the danger. Men loyal to her father would fight to keep the secrets buried, and blood could be spilled before the truth saw daylight. Still, she no longer trembled. Fear had been beaten out of her by lies. Only resolve remained. One evening, as the sun sank low, the rancher confronted her in the barn, his face red with rage, his revolver heavy at his side. He accused her of betrayal, of siding with his enemies, of turning her back on family. But she stood firm, her voice sharp as steel. "You betrayed this family long before I ever raised my voice." Her words struck deeper than any bullet, and for the first time, she saw something flicker in his eyes. Not rage, but fear. The West had no patience for weakness, and the rancher's authority, once untouchable, was crumbling with every truth his daughter carried. The stage was set for a reckoning, one that would not only decide the fate of a family, but would echo across the land as a warning to all who thought lies could outlast truth. The night of reckoning came with a storm rolling across the horizon, thunder growling like the judgment of heaven itself. The townsfolk gathered in the square, drawn not by invitation, but by instinct, for they sensed something long buried was about to erupt. At the center stood the bride, her veil gone, her gown stained by dust and truth. In her hand she held the ledgers and contracts, the very proof that could tear down the empire her father had built. The rancher, flanked by loyal men, faced her with fire in his eyes, his revolver gleaming beneath the lantern light. The crowd murmured, torn between fear of the rancher and curiosity for what his daughter would reveal. For years they had obeyed him, believing his wealth and pride to be unshakable. But whispers of his crimes had spread too far, and now, under the weight of his daughter's defiance, those whispers demanded air. The storm above mirrored the storm within the people, restless, electric, ready to break. The bride raised her voice, steady and strong, carrying over the thunder. She read aloud the names of families ruined, the land stolen, the lies written in ink and sealed with blood. Each word was a lash across the rancher's pride, each page a nail in the coffin of his authority. The townsfolk gasped, some in outrage, others in shame, as the truth they had long suspected came alive before their eyes. The rancher roared with fury, calling her a liar, a traitor, a child poisoned by enemies. He raised his revolver, his hand trembling with both rage and fear. But before he could strike, the people surged. Men who had once bowed to him now held him back, their loyalty shattered. Women stepped forward, their voices joining the bride's, demanding justice for years of silence. The balance of power, so long tilted by fear, shifted in a single heartbeat. In that moment, the bride did not flinch. Her eyes, burning with fire, met her father's, and she spoke words that silenced even the storm. "You built your name on lies. I will carry the truth." The revolver slipped from his hand, clattering into the dust. For the first time, the rancher looked not like a ruler, but like a man stripped bare by the truth he could not escape. When dawn broke, the storm had passed, leaving the town cleansed but forever changed. The rancher, once the most powerful man in the valley, stood disgraced, his empire of deceit crumbling like rotted wood. His loyal men scattered, unwilling to fight for a fallen master. The bride, no longer bound by obedience, now walked freely among the people, her name spoken not in pity but in respect. She had faced down the weight of blood, power, and fear, and prevailed. The runaway groom, humbled and ashamed, stood at her side, though she no longer needed him for strength. His confession had sparked the fire, but it was her courage that had carried it through the storm. He vowed to stand with her, not as her master or protector, but as an equal who had seen what true strength looked like. Whether she would forgive him remained uncertain, but the West was never about perfect endings. It was about survival, and the choices that carved destiny. The bride returned to the ranch house not as a daughter, but as its heir. She looked upon the land with new eyes, knowing it had been watered with betrayal. She vowed to rebuild it not with lies, but with honesty, even if it meant starting from nothing. The people, once broken by silence, now rallied around her, for they had seen what courage could do when spoken aloud. Her father, stripped of pride, sat alone in the shadows of what he had once ruled. His power was gone, but the scars of his deeds would remain. And though the bride carried no joy in his downfall, she carried no sorrow either. He had chosen his path, and she had chosen hers. The West was unforgiving, and so was truth. And so, the rancher's daughter became a legend, not for the wealth she inherited, but for the defiance that rewrote her fate. The West would remember her not as the bride forced into marriage, but as the woman who turned chains into fire, who broke silence with truth, and who proved that even in a land ruled by greed, the voice of one soul could bring an empire to its knees. The storm that swept through the rancher's empire left behind more than ruin. It left behind a lesson carved into the very soil of the West. A daughter once silenced had stood against power, had uncovered lies buried in wealth, and had turned what was meant to be her chains into the very fire that set her free. Her journey showed that blood and legacy cannot shield corruption forever, for truth has a way of breaking through the cracks, even in the harshest of lands. Her father's fall was not simply the end of a man's reign. It was the end of silence that had bound an entire town. For years, fear had been stronger than honesty, but one voice, steady, unyielding, proved that fear was never invincible. The people who once bowed their heads now lifted them, reminded that silence makes accomplices, but courage makes change. The runaway groom's role faded into the background, his cowardice forgiven only by the power of her resolve. His secret may have ignited the spark, but it was her strength that carried the flame through the storm. And that is where the true heart of this story lies, in a reminder that even those seen as powerless can become the very force that rewrites destiny. The rancher's daughter became more than a woman freed from a forced marriage. She became a legend, not for wealth, not for status, but for the truth she carried and the courage she displayed. In a land where lies often went unchallenged, she proved that truth, once spoken, could bring even the proudest to their knees. Her story echoes as a warning to those who build on deceit, and as a beacon to those who fear their voice is too small to matter. If her courage struck a chord in you, let it live beyond this story. Share your thoughts in the comments. Let others feel the power of her defiance by leaving your mark with a like, and keep these tales alive by subscribing to the channel. Just as her truth could not be silenced, your voice here ensures that stories of resilience and justice continue to ride across horizons far beyond the dust of the West.